life would have been unthinkable had I not chosen to forgive him in that moment. And that when I talk to people about it, it's like, given that moment of forgiveness, do it. Shut up and do it. Because you might not have another chance. I'm Sonya Reid, and I'm from Catalyst Church, and I am living proof that Jesus saves. And this is my story. I was 20. We moved to Jericho because my dad died. And that's where life gets kind of squirrely. I started going to United Christian Assembly when I was 14, and I got saved during that time when I was in 8th grade. I grew up with an alcoholic father and a Christian mother, and life was interesting living with an alcoholic, but as I got older, he got worse. I always thought it was maybe just because I was more aware of things he was doing, but he was getting worse as I got older. My mom and I moved out in January of 93 after 20 years of her being in a crazy marriage, and God was with us. He provided money for us to survive. We moved in with a good family. We survived. We managed to function between our 2 paychecks. We lived without my dad's money. In October, I went to go see him one day, and him and I got into a huge fight. And I walked away, and I went to work. And while I was at work that day, he called me up and begged my forgiveness. And I could have said, no, I'm not going to forgive you. Just go away. But instead, I forgave him in that second. And in that night, he killed himself. But I forgave him in that moment. And I cannot imagine what my life would be like had I not forgiven him. I could have just shut him up and said, sure, go away. But instead, I forgave him in that moment. And it was a good moment. God protected me and took care of me there. That weekend was pretty amazing because I was staying at a friend's house down the road where I didn't live. And I saw my dad and I got into a fight with him, and I went to work and I went back to my friend's house, which was 3 or 4 miles from my dad's house. And I didn't think anything of it. And the next morning, I had this goofy thought that God put in my head, because it's nobody else but him. He told me to take a bath. And to anybody else, that sounds stupid. But I took a bath because my friend had a bathtub and our apartment did not have a bathtub. So I'm like, well, I'm going to be late for church, but I'm going to take a bath. And I got to go to church. And instead of taking the shortcut, which would have driven me right by my dad's house, God made me go the long way around. So I went the long way around, and I got to church that day without knowing what had happened to my family. And later on that afternoon, I was surrounded by my church friends when we were told that my dad killed himself. But looking back on it, it was amazing to know that God had protected me from finding him. I could have been the one to find him, and that would have messed up everything so much more. My mom and I knew at that point that we were able to survive without him, in spite of how difficult that would be. The last few years my dad was alive, my dad really did try to get some serious help. He was getting worse, and he knew that. But he was also going to church, doing Bible studies, going to AA, and was getting encouraged and was doing the work that the world said that he needed to do, and that my mom and I kind of wanted him to do. And it seemed to be working. So when he did actually die, we were all kind of shocked. When my dad died, they did an autopsy on him to make sure how he died. And he shot himself, but lived 3 hours after he did the deed. And we fully believe that God used that time to reconcile him to himself, because he had nowhere else to be but between him and God. And knowing what I know about God and about my dad, that's pretty significant. And I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, I will see him again someday. Later years, going through a significant amount of depression when I was in Minnesota. And God kept me all those times that I was very depressed. And I felt like ending it myself. He was with me, and he kept me with friends and family surrounding me at all times to keep me going. And it was actually a godsend dealing with that depression, because I could actually understand my dad's problems and not judge him for them. It actually made me feel closer to him, to have kind of endured some of what he endured. Be much more compassionate to people with life problems, and I think more compassionate on myself than I could have been, because I'm a Christian. Aren't we all supposed to lead great lives? 100% of the time. My dad's mom was a true inspiration to me in the faith. She kept me going for many, many years. It was amazing how God used the mixing of two very strange families in different ways to create a good legacy. I moved back to Vermont in 2018 after being gone exactly 20 years. And I'm actually very thankful that I moved back when I did, because I don't know that I could have survived life in the COVID world, being by myself and being very strongly depressed. God really blessed me when I moved back to Vermont, because amazingly enough, a lot of my depression symptoms went away, and I've actually been very functional in ways I hadn't been in years. And it amazed me that in spite of who I grew up with, my dad left an amazing legacy. He left a legacy of, you can be saved by grace, and no matter what you've done, you're still forgiven.